You always want to tell them the problem you're going to try to solve?
Yeah.
Who has a problem?
A problem is that whenever astronauts go into space, they feel homesick, lonely, and they miss things on Earth.
So our solution was that since smell and memories and emotions go to the same spot, and smell can evoke memories, we said that we can use smell to help evoke emotions and memories so that they can feel like they're at home and feel comfortable. Like smells of nature, vegetables.
Yeah.
Okay. Come down here closer.
Yeah. So, I've definitely experienced that myself. I mean, I think we all have. I mean, there's sometimes when you walk into a building and you don't notice that it smells, but if you ever come back to that building or if you ever smell something like it, you're like, oh, this smells like that. For example, when I'm in mission control, flying the space station, that building has a smell, and it is unique to that building. And I'll always, wherever I am, if I ever smell something like it, I instantly feel like I'm back in the control center at NASA. And so I know exactly what you're talking about with those smells of home. And it's an interesting challenge because that is a factor that crew members talk about when they come back into a mission and they come back to Earth after having been gone for 6 months. They talk about some of the things they miss, and it's things like smells and green and wind and some of those tastes and a shower that are some of the things that they really miss in space.
You want to show them the device
so
you made?
we made a device to help that. It's cotton or a pill in this little area.
Yeah.
Where the air pushes it into this pig nose where you can smell it, and when you breathe back out, when you breathe out, the air goes, the smell comes back into this tube, to the TCCS where it contains it and filters it.
Cool. So it basically keeps the off-gassing source of the smell from getting into the space station atmosphere control system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So of home, like how do you capture the smell of home? Like that's sometimes it's a really hard thing to be able to replicate those smells perfectly. So how do you do that?
Well, what I would do is, for example, maybe you like it when you enter your home, because usually the some items that create that smell, maybe like a personal curtain or carpet. You could take a little piece of that instead of the whole house.
Yeah. So here's something that's really interesting, and we've been trying to figure this out on the space shuttle and on the space station for a while. Is that whenever astronauts go out on a spacewalk, so they're going outside of the space station and they're outside in their spacesuits, and they're in a vacuum, right? There's no atmosphere of Earth. There is no real gas molecules out there bouncing around in gas form. But when they come inside during a spacewalk, all the crew members that stayed inside can smell a very unique smell from the suit that was outside, and they call it the smell of space. So they say it smells a little bit like almost like a burning kind of metal, like a little bit of a charred metal electrical smell, but they can't replicate it. And we tried in the past to have a bottle to try to take a collection of the gas right after someone comes back from a spacewalk, and we brought it down to the ground and we run it through gas spectrometers to try to analyze it, and we can't see anything in the trace of it, but everyone identifies it's a very unique smell, and all the astronauts know exactly what they're talking about and smell it after spacewalk. So it's not just spacewalk. Sometimes when you dock a spaceship to a space station and you open up the hatch, that new spaceship, the part of it that was outside, has that same smell of space to it, which I think is really interesting. And it's such a small amount that we can't detect it in gas at home, and so it's got to get 1 part per billion, very, very, very small concentrations that we're able to detect with our nose and smell.
Boys, do you want to ask him some of your questions? Or?
What do you do at NASA?
I'm a flight director, and a flight director is basically the guy or woman who is in charge of mission control. So you think of an airplane who's flying the airplane, and the ground is helping them out. They have the air traffic controllers, which are helping with navigation, helping with communications, routing. The space station is a little bit different. So the astronauts aren't flying the space station. Really, it's the computers and the ground controllers that are flying the space station, to make sure it's flying straight, to make sure that the solar arrays are generating electricity, to make sure that the thermal control systems are cooling things down correctly. We plan the schedule for the astronauts' day down to the 5-minute blocks. We schedule the science that they're going to do. When things break, we tell them where their spare parts are. We write their procedures and send them up. And so the flight director is really in charge of that entire team. And they have the responsibility to keep the crew members safe, to keep the space station healthy and flying, and then to complete all of the objectives, all the mission objectives we have, whether it's science, whether it's new experiments or new kind of operations we've never done before. So that's what the flight director does. And then below, sort of below me on my team, I have people that represent all of the different disciplines. So there's a person who's in charge of the electricity. There's a person who's in charge of the communications equipment. Another person's in charge of the crew's computers and internet. Another person's in charge of robotic operations. And so they all sort of form a team and report to me when they have issues, and we go through and solve the problems. It's great.
That's cool.
Do you enjoy your job?
I love my job.
I
totally love it. It is so cool. So I've been doing the job I have now for about 4 years, and before that, typically what happens to get to be a flight director is someone comes and works for NASA in a different way, as sort of a lower level job, and then work their way up. So I started in EVA, which is the group in charge of spacewalks. And so I started on that team. I started training the astronauts how to do spacewalks. I worked several of the space shuttle missions when the space shuttle was flying. And then after that, I became a flight director in 2014. It is the coolest job. I love it because no day is the same. Like one day I might be planning how to fix a broken toilet on the space station. Another day I might be planning how much oxygen the crew members need to be able to breathe. Another day we're doing a spacewalk. Another day I'm scheduling satellites to be able to give us communication. And then some days I'm just calling the crew on the phone to say hi and make sure that they know that we've got their back, and telling them a funny joke.
Were you on duty when they had the hole?
So that's a great question. I was not on duty myself, but a person in my office was. We have someone on shift every day, every hour for the past 20 years. Someone's been there's always been someone there. So it wasn't me personally on that time. I was on the day before it happened.
Oh, no.
A very small team of people that's trying to investigate what happened with that leak. With that leak in that hole to better understand it, so we can make sure the crew stays safe.
Cool.
Do you want to go to space?
Yes, that has been a dream of mine for my entire life. It's really hard to get to be an astronaut, and there's advantages and disadvantages to that job. The astronauts are very much sort of the public face of NASA. They're the ones you see in the pictures. They're the ones you see on TV. They're the ones that get to go on the trip itself to go into space and have that adventure. But for every astronaut, there are thousands of people on the ground that make their missions possible. Mm-hmm. And like I said, that's really not the only way to make a big impact on spaceflight, because they're not flying the spaceships. A lot of times it's the ground that's flying the spaceships, and they're up there because we need someone to do the experiment. We need someone to be able to turn the wrenches when it breaks or go on a spacewalk. But there's so many different ways, and I've really found that I can, in many ways, make almost as big or bigger an impact in advancing human spaceflight as a flight director than I would be able to do as an astronaut.
Okay.
But I would love it. It would be so fun to float around. It'd be really cool.
So then how do you teach the astronauts to basically do space flights if you've not been in space?
Yeah, that's a good question, and people ask that a lot. And so if you think about the background that astronauts may have, they are selected to come from a diverse background. That many of them come from the military, many of them may be scientists, some of them may be teachers, and so we take them and we train them to get to that point where they can fly in space. Mm-hmm. But they have to, when they fly in space, they have to have knowledge about a very, very wide breadth of information. So they know a lot about many systems, from, like I said, robotics to spacewalks to science and geology and photography, and they know how to do news interviews, and they know how to live in a small can. But really, they never have to really be the experts on those systems. They don't have to be the best and the smartest person on how a life support system regenerates their urine into water. We need people on the ground who really understand the chemistry, and they understand the mechanisms for how that works. And there are people on the ground who designed that spaceship. There are people on the ground who wrote the procedures they use and came up with the techniques. And so it's really easy to understand how, when you think of it that way, that the people that have devoted the time to really developing the techniques and spent more time studying and specializing on a particular topic are able to then teach that to the astronauts. Again, the astronauts don't have to be the experts on any one thing.
Got it. Who's next?
Yeah.
Have you ever been through astronaut training?
Have I ever been to astronaut training? So when I was in high school, it wasn't astronaut training, but I went to Space Academy. So it's like Space Camp. You may have heard of that, but there's a place in Huntsville, Alabama. They had one, I think they still have one in Florida, where you can go for a week and go through sort of a simulated astronaut experience there. So that sort of was one of my early introductions to it when I was in 10th grade. But that wasn't really the same thing. It's sort of a good exposure at a NASA facility. Mm-hmm. When I came to NASA myself, when I was fresh out of college, I went through much of the same training the astronauts get. So when back to the previous question, in order to be able to teach an astronaut a class, I had to get certified to be able to teach that class, and in doing so, I would take many of the same classes that the astronauts would take, so I could know those classes very well, so I could teach them. And then, so I got to be an expert on spacewalks. Then when I got to be a flight director, I had to go through the exact same training that an astronaut gets. Because the flight director really has to know things as well or even better than the astronauts do, because, as I said, the ground's flying the vehicle. Mm-hmm. The crew's along for the ride. We need to know how to do it and how to respond when things break. So I've been through the exact same training that an astronaut gets, but with a different role.
Okay.
What are some of the challenges you have faced in your job?
Some of the challenges that I think are really interesting with the International Space Station compared to the Space Shuttle is that we, being an international space station, we have to deal with space flight organizations from all around the world. And so we have partners in Russia, we have partners in Japan, we have partners in Europe and Canada, and all around the United States. And now we're getting commercial partners with different companies like SpaceX and Boeing and Sierra Nevada. And so with each of these different countries and companies, there are cultural differences and there are technology differences, and there's different interests and motivations that all these countries have and what they hope to get out of spaceflight. And so at NASA, we really have to figure out how to bring everyone together and make it so that everyone can work together as a collective team rather than working against each other. And how you work with the Russians is in some ways very different from how you might work with the Japanese and how you work with SpaceX. So that's one of the challenges I think is actually really fun, but it is actually sometimes really hard. And then one of the other things I would say is that when you're a flight director and you're sitting on console, so you're on a shift flying the space station, you have to be aware that really at any time during your job, it could be a quiet time in the middle of the night with the crew asleep, and you could be watching the world go by through the cameras, and then the next minute there could be alarms going off and the crew's life could be in your hands, and you need to be ready to and be prepared to respond to any emergency at any time. So it really instills a sense of responsibility that you have to know your stuff, you have to pay attention in the training, you have to make sure you're staying current in all those trainings and really take the responsibility of your job, because these astronauts have wives, they have husbands, they have children, they have family, and I want to get them back home to them.
Yeah, definitely.
What do astronauts eat? Can you please give us specific meals so that we can know what smells we can potentially deliver to astronauts to enhance meals?
Yeah, there's been a lot of advancement in the food technology. We actually have a food laboratory down here where they try to cook meals, and so it's not just smells, but it's also tastes that have a very similar reaction in terms of memory response. And so when someone's gone from a long time, you want to be able to give them that comfort feeling, the comfort foods that they may associate with home. But at the same time, you have to be very deliberate about their caloric intake, the nutritional balance that they're getting to make sure that they're going to stay healthy for a long time, as their bones may be feeling getting degeneration of their bones, atrophy of their muscles. So you probably need to make sure you're giving them the right nutrients to support the work that they're doing. So there's a laboratory that I said that really develops and makes sure that these food portions are all very well measured and calibrated for what those people need. And so they'll try to make foods that match some of their preferences. And so they have some standard foods that astronauts can choose from. And one of the favorites they talk about is like shrimp cocktail. They'll have like spaghetti and meatballs. They'll have like beef stroganoff. They might have macaroni and cheese. They'll have green beans, carrots, mashed potatoes, coffee, tea, juice. Some of the things that are really special are things like fresh fruit and ice cream. And so you might think, how do you get fresh fruit up to the space station without having it rot or having the ice cream melt? And so this is something that we do when there's a new cargo vehicle that's about to launch the space station. There's a new cargo vehicle that comes up every 2 months or so to bring new food and clothes and experiments and so forth. What we'll do is we'll rush out to the launch pad before they launch that vehicle, and one of the last things we'll stow in there is a bag with some maybe oranges or lemons or apples, and a cooler with a bunch of ice packs and some ice cream bars in there. And then a couple hours later, the rocket will blast up. Maybe a day or so later, that will arrive at the space station, and the first thing the astronauts will do when they get it all connected and hooked up, they'll go in, find that bag of ice cream, take it out, put it in the freezers that they have on the space station, and then they get to eat fresh ice cream. And it'll last for a couple days in the freezer before they've just wiped it completely out. And they'll eat the fruit, and they say that's one of their best things because it has the smell of an orange. Will really bring back both the taste and the color of fresh vegetables. The sight, the taste, the smell is all something they really love. But it only lasts for a short period of time before they go back to their packaged food. And a lot of their foods that I mentioned before, it's not like they're giving you a plate of spaghetti. The water in food, there's actually a lot of water in food, and that makes it heavy, that makes it hard to launch. It doesn't last as well. The food will rot over time. So we have a vacuum which sucks out all the moisture, and then we seal it so it preserves for a long time. When they're ready to use it, they'll insert a straw which injects water into the food and rehydrates it, and it can warm it up, and then that sort of tastes normal again.
So since food is a big part of basically smell and the experience there. Do all the astronauts eat together, or it's basically each one of them has their own lunchtime?
Yeah, so the way that the space station is organized, there are several modules on the back of the space station that were launched by Russia. And then forward of that, you have what's called the US operating segment, which are a bunch of modules that are shared by US, the Canadians, the Russians, sorry, not the Russians, the Japanese and the Europeans. And there's typically 2 people who live and sleep back on the Russian segment, and then everyone else sort of stays in some sleeping compartments on the forward side. And so most of the U.S. operating segment will eat a lot of their meals for like lunch and breakfast on the U.S. side, but most crews will typically make a point a couple times a week to make sure that everyone gets together on the Russian side and they have like a group meal and that shared time, because during the day, although they're in a small, relatively small space station with a lot of people, they may not see people all day long. Mm-hmm. So they'll go through their whole day, and we've scheduled their day down to the 5-minute blocks. They could be going and doing a repair, and then they could be having their hands in a glove box, or they could be taking care of a protein experiment or a combustion experiment or doing some maintenance. And so they may not see some of their other crewmates all day long. So getting that time where they can go and have a meal together is really important. The lunchtime meal is a little bit harder to schedule together, but we're able to get breakfast and evenings together. In the morning for breakfast, a lot of times those are much more quick kind of meals. Sometimes they'll kind of take a coffee and some granola or something like that. A lot of times they're anxious to get going and starting their day, but dinner times are pretty well protected.
Mm-hmm.
When they drink coffee, doesn't it go all the way to the sky, or do they have this like Starbucks thing that they drink from?
Yeah, so what they do is there's actually some really good videos of this that you can find on YouTube, where all of the liquids, if you didn't have them in a bag, would float around, and they'd have bubbles of liquids that float around. There's a lot of times where crewmembers will intentionally let some of those bubbles free, they'll float up and kind of gobble up the liquid, and it can be fun to sort of play with it that way. But it can get to be messy too. So if usually what they'll do is it's just like a drink bag that just has a straw in it, and so you can just sort of drink it like that. There's also a really interesting friend of mine named Don Pettit, who's an astronaut, and he is a really brilliant scientist as well. And he discovered that surface tension is able to hold liquid together in a ball in zero gravity. Mm-hmm. And if you make the shape of a cup just right, you can make a groove with the right angle on it, then capillary action will actually cause, in zero gravity, liquid to flow. Mm. So you can have an open cup, sort of like this, and with the right shape on it, you can tilt it, and capillary action will cause the coffee to flow towards your mouth, so you can drink it even without a straw. Cool. Even in zero gravity. You can almost pour liquid out of a cup. It's kind of an interesting challenge, because without the exact shape of that cup, you wouldn't be able to drink your coffee. It would have to be in a bag you could chuck. There's pictures and videos of that online for sure.
Cool.
Do astronauts have something like a device?
Like you mean like an iPad or an iPhone or something?
No, like our device that we created.
Oh, like that. So there are actually things like that, and actually I think today or tomorrow they are doing an experiment like this. It's not actually for smell, it's for a different reason though. But what they do is, rather than trying to give the crew a stimulus with a smell to sort of evoke a memory, what they're doing is sometimes they have a very controlled gas mixture, and they want to see how the gas diffuses through cell membranes within the crew members and how much they then get metabolized and then exhaled at different pressures. So one of the experiments that they're doing, I think they're doing the next day or so, they go into the airlock and they depress the airlock to a lower pressure, just about 10-2 psi. So it's about the same pressure as if you were in Colorado, maybe a little bit higher in mountains like that. And they wear this special mask that actually looks very similar to what you have there, and it covers their nose and mouth, and it has a source gas that is a unique mixture, that they can then able to breathe, and they're able to then when they exhale, it goes through an outlet check valve, and they're able to see exactly how much of that gas they metabolized within their lungs and across their cells. There's another experiment that has a similar kind of contraption like that, where the crew members will put this on, and then they will go exercise on a bike, and while they're exercising, they're breathing in oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide, and you can see what their maximum oxygen consumption rate is, and that tells us a little bit about how hard their muscles are working, because you need to metabolize to turn the oxygen into carbon dioxide, and you can see how your muscles are absorbing that. You can get an indication of how fit the crew members are on orbit by doing this kind of test. But it has to be controlled so that everything they're breathing in is measured and everything they breathe out gets measured. So it's very much a mask like that they have to use.
Can we send a device in your spaceship after we're done building it?
So that's a little bit harder to do than being able to send it up there, because there's a lot of safety requirements that have to go through to get hardware to flown up to the space station. For example, you'd have to make sure that the materials that you built it out of aren't off-gassing things that could be bad. Like, so it is the plastic venting off gases that they might not want to have there. Is the strap that you have built on it, is that flammable? Because even things like, they used to have some Legos up on the space station. The Japanese wanted the astronauts to build Legos in space, and you can again find some pictures of these or some videos of this on YouTube. But one of the actual problems was that Legos are flammable, believe it or not. And one thing you really don't want to have in space is a fire. We had some before on the Mir space station, and that is one of the major emergencies that we protect for. Mm-hmm. So things like Ziploc bags and Legos and paper and cloth fabrics all can burn if they're in the right environment. So you have to be pretty careful about some of them. But yeah, I wouldn't have thought Legos were a flammable thing, but in fact, by the safety processes, they were. The other thing about flying things up to the space station is that it takes energy to lift up everything. Just as, when you pick up something in your hand, it takes energy to lift that up. Well, to get the energy to get it up into space, it takes a lot of rocket fuel, and there's a very limited space on the space station. So it has to be something that that has a lot of value to get up there, because it costs a lot of money and there's not much you can get up there. So you want to make sure you're really sending up things. But that said, there are schools that have done that have built hardware similar to what you're talking about here, and they've flown it up. So a lot of times NASA has this program called Hunch, where we will tell some schools and people that are participating in this program about a problem that we have at NASA that we need to get solved, and then they let the schools go and try to develop a solution. And they'll work with a mentor, and they'll go and actually build the hardware, and they'll work with them at NASA to make sure that they're building it correctly and it's getting certified, and then they've launched it up there. We have Hunch projects where kids have built new tools. They built a privacy curtain so that when the crews are taking a shower, when they're getting clean, they aren't spraying water on hardware. It sort of gives them some privacy, but also contains some of the waters and soaps from getting sprayed around. There's several kind of Hunch projects, we call that where students have gotten things flown.
Cool.
Anything else?
Hey, I have one thing. I have to go back and say. So when you were asking about food, another cool thing about the international space, about the fact that it's an international space station, is a lot of times if we have a Japanese astronaut up there, a lot of times they'll bring foods from their home country. So you might get a Japanese astronaut, you get some Japanese food. The Russian will bring the Russian delicacies, and someone from Europe might bring European foods. And so a lot of times you sort of get this mishmash of food from all over the world from these different cultures, and they'll sort of prepare feasts, especially like the holidays. Everyone will bring in a element of or piece of food from their home country, and they'll have this big international eating festival.
It's like trading in the cafeteria.
Yeah. Sorry, back to your question. I thought that was just a cool little.
No, it is. So, but then when you have so many different kinds of foods, they all have their distinct smells. Then how do you take care of those smells up there?
So, if the smell's coming from food, we know the ingredients in the food. We know the other thing we do for any hardware that flies up the space station is we do an assessment of the materials in it and assess it for toxicity.
Right.
So, for example, we want to know if this were to float into someone's eye, would it burn their eyes or would it cause tissue damage? If this were to be inhaled, would that be bad? Does this thing have a sharp edge that could cut them if they were floating by? So we do that, and we know that things like food aren't toxic, so they're put in the non-toxic category. There's some cases where you have to be a little bit careful about some things getting into our atmosphere scrubbers and damaging the equipment, but generally food isn't the type of thing that we're overly concerned about. So likely some of the things that you're trying to do with smells, you may not have to completely filter it out from the space station environment, especially if it's something that is okay for the astronaut to breathe. It likely is going to be okay also for the environment of the space station.
I see.
Yeah, we have basically what happens is a lot of things that get out in the atmosphere will condense in the humidity, and we have environmental systems which condense the moisture. That water then gets flowed to a system which does a massive processing system with filters and hydrolysis and UV and osmosis filters to really scrub it out, and they do a baking thing to make it almost pure water, which is why you can take urine or sweat, recollect it, and filter it, and it ends up being some of the most pure water you've ever had to drink.
Actually, that's one of the things that they read. They said that in space, astronauts are not allowed to take fragrances because they don't want the whole space station to smell of, let's say, one perfume. So they kind of are basically brainstorming that if there's a smell there at home, basically we just open a window, let the air come in and go. So how would they do it in space? That's why they devised their device where even when you breathe out, it contains it and takes it basically to DCCS. But
So so they have deodorant, for example, on the space station. So there's other ways to deliver a smell. You want, because you're living with a small group of people for a long time, you sort of want to be respectful of the fact that the smell that you might like might not be the smell that someone else would like. So you're right, you don't want to necessarily contaminate the environment with a smell that people find offensive.
Okay.
But there's certainly smells that get shared with food and so forth. And there's something you said about the fact that when I mentioned before taking a shower, it's not really a shower like you and I would think of. It's not like you're standing in running water.
Right.
It might be you're taking a washcloth that's a little bit damp and rubbing it on you, and you take some shampoo that doesn't need to get rinsed, and you sort of wipe in your hair and then wipe it off. And so people, it can get a little ripe. It's not always the finest smelling group of people in the world, especially when they're exercising for 3 hours a day. So the smells of the space station, people have described them as kind of a mix of purified air and sort of almost a hospital type smell because of the air purifiers, but also there can be a little bit of a musty smell in some areas. If fabric gets wet, it can mold. We've had cases where we've detected mold on the space station. There's a little bit of body odor in the exercise areas. Sometimes this is going to be a little bit gross when you go to the bathroom. We have the urine gets recycled, but the poop kind of just gets stored in a bag in a container, and we have seals and clamps on it to really try to shut that down. But if that trash vehicle hasn't left it for a while, sometimes it builds up, and sometimes in some areas, members will be like, "Yeah, that smells bad. Let's get that off of here as quickly as possible." But I think another thing that I was thinking about with your design, you have to also think about is this something that crew members are going to want to be wearing just from like how it feels, and would you want to be having a conversation with someone with this thing in your face if you didn't kind of have to? And is there sort of an awkwardness, like a social awkwardness of it, that would sort of be traded with the benefit of the smells you want? But that's just something also to think about, especially since there are good ways to get smells. But Another thing is, are there other things besides just smells you might want to have? Like maybe you want to be able to deliver medicine, like a unique medicine to a person that has to be inhaled in a certain way. So it could be a delivery method for certain medicines.
Yeah. Well, how do we make it? With what parts?
Yeah.
What parts did you use to make that?
We use part for nebulizers.
Nebulizers and.
Swallow.
Yeah, that's why it looked like that.
Okay. Ignorance. Who has the next one?
Are there any more questions that he hasn't answered already? Or?
What are your thoughts on our device?
Well, he just told us that. So look at your question, see if he's already answered it.
He's already answered. Oh wait. Do astronauts take smells with them to space?
Do they take what?
Smells.
No.
Some fragrances. Yes,
Do
they
they
do.
take smells with them to
They
space?
take deodorants and,
Oh,
they,
yeah.
and the
Okay,
food
okay.
that smells.
So
Yes.
that's already answered.
Yeah.
Does anybody have some
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
answers?
So-
Oh yeah, I do.
Hey, so another thing about smells that's kind of interesting is that you don't really get to do laundry up in space because we don't have washing machines and you don't have a lot of water, and so you also don't get. I talked before about it's hard to fly up equipment, and so you don't get fresh underwear every day. You don't get a fresh shirt every day. You don't get fresh pants every day. Okay? So typically what you do is you end up wearing the same clothes for a couple days or a week at a time, and then you kind of throw it out when it's done. So one thing that we've done is we've figured out that there's treatments you can do on certain clothing, like exercise clothing, and it has a microbicide in it that will actually kill microbes that can cause bad smells. And astronauts have worn the same gym clothes for over a month, and they're like, yeah, it still smells fresh as a daisy. So managing the good smells is almost as important as managing the bad smells, which is pretty key.
So why did you guys design the device to just be limited to one person?
Because someone else might not like the smell that they have, or that they just don't want it anymore. So if that one person still wants it, and the other people don't, he can experience it by himself, while the other people can do whatever they want.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really thoughtful way to sort of think about how can you make enable the crew members to be good expeditionary crew members? How do you make it so they can interact well with the people that are going to be up there? Because you can definitely cause rifts and challenges socially if someone's not able to get along with everyone else in their group, and if someone's going up there and flooding the cabin with smells, everyone will be like, dude, get away, you stink. It may smell like roses to you, but it smells like my grandma's living room to me, so stop it, right? So I think that there's some good thought that went into the design that you have there to be able to protect the crews. Another way to do it, another way to think about this is the astronauts have some areas where they have some privacy, but not much. So their what's called their crew quarters are almost about the size of a phone booth, where they're able to go and sleep every night. So they're able to hang their sleeping bag in there. They have a laptop computer in there that they can FaceTime with their family. They can have maybe their books and some pictures in there. And if there was a little bit of a smell in that might not exchange as much air necessarily with everyone else. We do have fans in there to make sure that when they sleep, they don't get carbon dioxide around their face and cause them to pass out in the middle of the night. But there are certain areas like that where if someone had a little spot of perfume or a little spot of a smell on a piece of paper in that place, it probably wouldn't be too offensive to the rest of the crew members.
Cool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Who works on the filtration system?
Who works on the what?
Filtration system.
There are many different. There are several different kinds of filtration systems. So there are some that have to filter the air. So for air you have to get rid of the carbon dioxide. You have to make sure there's enough nitrogen, enough oxygen, and it's the right total pressure. So we try to keep the pressure of the space station around 740 millimeters of mercury, which is about 14.3 psi. So it's similar to what it's like on the surface of the Earth. And we always want to make the percentage of oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen, to be at a good range. If there's too much oxygen, then it can cause fires. If there's not enough oxygen, that's not safe for the crew members. So we have a system, like I talked before about how we condense the water out of the air from the humidity. Well, we take that water that we can collect and we'll put electrical current through it, and that will release hydrogen and oxygen. So we'll use that to generate more replacement oxygen from that water. But then with that hydrogen, there's a reaction called the Sabatier reaction, where when you combine hydrogen with carbon dioxide, you can create water again and a little bit of methane. So the methane we vent overboard because we don't need it. In theory, you could collect it and compress it and make rocket fuel if you want it, but we don't. We let it go overboard. But with that, we're able to regenerate water. We're able to use water to make oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide in the filters as well. So that's sort of how the whole closed loop system works.
Cool.
And there's a bunch of engineers who work both at NASA and work for companies that have won contracts to go build this hardware for us. So there's a company called United Technologies that actually builds a lot of the life support systems on the space station. So that's about the gas. Then there's the same thing you have to do with water, where you have to collect water from sweat, and from when you exhale you have water, and you drink water, and then pee it out, you have to collect that, and all that you're trying to get back. So about 90% of all of the water gets reused again and again and again and again. There's only about 10% that we aren't able to reclaim. And so we have all these systems on the US operating side, but then there's also similar systems that are completely different in design, but similar principles on the Russian side. And the more people on space station, the more carbon dioxide you have to scrub out. And when sometimes this equipment might break, and now we have to figure out how do we get by without a carbon dioxide scrubber until we can get it fixed without exposing the crew to a toxic environment. So sometimes we have to work pretty fast to fix things, otherwise the crew will get sick or have to come home.
Right.
Sometimes
Okay, so any other? Yes. How much personal stuff can astronauts bring into space?
What personal stuff? So they get
how
a
much
small.
personal stuff?
Sorry, say again.
How much personal stuff?
How much personal stuff? So they get things called PPKs, which is personal something kits. I can't remember what the second P stands for. These are kits where astronauts will fly a little memento for their friends, or maybe people who work at NASA who really help them get ready for the mission. So I can actually show you one like this. So this is something that they fly for friends. I've got one over here. I don't know if you can see this. So this is a letter a love letter that my wife wrote me, and I had that flown into space a while ago. This was back in this was in 2002. There's a letter here that talks about how this flew into space. Then I have, whoa, things are falling down. hang on just a second. So a friend of mine who was in space last year, he renewed his wedding vows when he was up there. Oh. And this was the bow tie from his crewmates, that his crewmate wore when he was up there. And so he gave me the bow tie from his wedding. And then he flew this picture. Oops, hang on a sec. I asked him to fly this picture of my family. And you can see,
cool.
You can see there's the picture up in space. So there it is There it is up in space, and there it is. And they put a little, stamp on the back of it saying this is officially on the space station and signed. That's it. So they'll do that. They can maybe get about, it's not much. It's a pretty small container that they can do to fly for friends. So those have to be like really small things, like a picture or a piece of paper that they can fold. Then they also get to fly some of their own stuff. So they'll get to fly up books, or a lot of times they'll actually do less books now, and they'll send up electronic books on like an iPad or something like that. Mm-hmm. But they'll send up they'll have pictures of their family. They'll have little mementos to remind them of home. Maybe some trinkets, and they get a small bag. Maybe hang on a second. This big, maybe 3 feet across. They'll get one of that with some personal things. They'll get a couple of those bags that they get to the store, but they don't get a ton of their own personal stuff. They sort of have to pick and choose what they really want. Maybe there's a piece of jewelry they want to have up there, or whatever.
And you have to, yes. Would there be a way to attach our device to a filtration system? Which filtration system would you recommend?
I missed the first part of it. It was something about what filtration system would you recommend?
Come forward.
Tell them again.
Would there be a way to adapt our device to a filtration system? Which filtration system would you recommend?
So is there a way to adapt your filtration system?
Attach it.
Attach
Oh,
our
attach.
device to a filter.
So are you saying like attach it to the life support systems in the space station?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Let me think about that. So the way the life support systems work is, they have, big air vents, sort of like, there's an air vent in my ceiling. They have a bunch of those throughout the space station. They're pretty distributed. So those wouldn't probably be the best things to connect into, because it's a big open vent with a filter across it. So there wouldn't be a really good way to plug it in. And you're really trying to control where the outlet of the gas goes and what's going into it. A lot of times you might not have to actually plug it in or connect it into a life support system perfectly. For example, if you were to exhale those smells, if it's just near a vent, that might be good enough to make sure it all just gets sucked into the vent. You might not have to have a perfect seal on it to make sure that absolutely every molecule of that smell gets sucked in. If 95% of it gets sucked in it near that vent, that might be good enough. If you were really worried about making sure that absolutely no leakage occurred, you'd probably want to exhale it into like a collection bag that you could then compress, and maybe that is something you then don't recycle. Maybe that's something that sort of gets vented overboard, or that's something that gets thrown out, or I'm trying to think. There isn't really ones that have like hard, plug connections that are totally leak-proof to suck back in. We really are trying to get as much mixing from the whole station atmosphere, so we have these big vents like I showed you in my house to pull things in.
Cool.
Is that it?
Do you foresee a problem that our device would face in microgravity?
So let me see your device again. Pull it up.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so why don't you put it on and walk around? Okay, now someone else.
Is it
Okay.
built to be walking around?
It's not really built to be walking around because the TCCS is also very big.
It's just to get a whiff and go on with your day.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I think you want to be careful to make sure that you don't get too tangled in the tubing there. So wait, the TCCS. Did you research about the TCCS?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. That's great that you know what the trace contaminant control system is. That's fantastic. Yeah, so the
so that's
containment control system is really trying to scrub out a lot of the trace gases that we have on the space station that are really in much lower concentration. So with those, we aren't really trying to reprocess what gets removed out of the well. So we're just filtering down, letting the rest of the stream go downstream. The only thing, yeah, I mean, I think if you're blowing that into the TCCS, you know, would you be concerned of it getting ripped off? As someone's floating around, it's a lot easier for things to get snagged, and so you want to have some way to make it so that if it fell off your face, the flow would stop automatically. That could be one thing.
Yeah, but it just occurred to me. So we could have the whole smell in the ISS, but then some people that could like be disturbed by the smell, they could have those like masks that just
Have everybody in the space station wearing masks?
no, like people that there's these like masks that just like take out oxygen.
The gas mask?
Yeah, the gas mask.
So I think you just hit on something that's actually pretty interesting, though, like a different way to look at the problem. So, you know, all along we've been talking about how to solve the problem to contain the gas to only the person who wants it. But a totally other way to solve the problem might be let everyone else breathe it and only protect the person who doesn't want to smell it.
There you go.
And maybe that's an easier problem to solve. In which case, in that case, all you need is the person who doesn't want it just wears like a dust mask or something, or one of the respirator masks, and we have those on space station already. And those will have carbon filters that will filter out smells like that. That might be an easier way to solve the problem. That way, you wouldn't actually even need, you know, a mask that everyone else has to wear. Everyone else could just have it out there in the cabin. You could breathe it for a little bit, and it would get sucked out and filtered out through the system. It wouldn't stay there for very long. So it might not be a big deal. Or you could say, hey, we're going to do this smell over here in this module in this room. And so if the guy who doesn't like it, you go a couple rooms down. And why don't you go exercise? While you're exercising, we're going to do it by the time you're done exercising, it'll be over.
Yeah.
And then maybe that way you don't even need a device.
Yeah,
that's cool.
could
You
work.
can just like put a little squirt in the atmosphere, and people who like it, they're like, okay, we're done. Everyone, the guy who didn't like it was down exercising in a different place, and it's cleaned up by the time you get back.
Oh, that's cool.
Anybody else? Are we all done?
I think we might be finished all the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey. So something that's really cool that's coming up is on Monday, if the weather's good. So I need you guys to look at the weather forecast for southern Japan. In southern Japan, there's some storms coming, which is bad news. But if the weather clears up, there's going to be a rocket launch from Tanegashima, Japan, and it's going to be bringing up cargo to the space station, and it's going to arrive on the 14th in the morning. And so I'm leading that flight. I'm the lead flight director for that mission, and on it, they are bringing up a new life support rack, which is going to do all of the life support filtering and rejuvenation that we've been talking about with a brand new system. So you'll be able to watch that blast into space.
Oh, cool.
It's going to be really cool. It's going to take all these different boxes that, like I said, generate oxygen and generate water and filter out CO2. It's all going to put it into one contained box. It's going to be super cool to have that on the space station. It's going to blast off. It's a really cool rocket launch.
Okay.
Cool.
Cool. Look out for it.
Hey, thanks so much for letting the boys interview you on a Friday afternoon. But,
My pleasure. It's great to see you.
Can I ask one more thing? Can I take a picture with them beside you on the screen?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
You can like pass them. I'll send you a picture of them.
Hey, now we can fly.
Alright.
You want to see?
Okay, boys.
Like, okay?
Oh, look, he's waving. Cheese.
Okay.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, posing. Okay, awesome. Thanks a bunch.
Cool.
What are you doing? Calling.
Jason, sorry you missed, but Sean said because he was gonna let Sean go play at a friend's house and